So, hello and welcome to what is one of the most important topics within chess. We are beginning an extensive look into tactics. And why are tactics so important? Well, many people, and I would agree with this, many people will break down chess into two broad categories. They say it's a game of strategy, so there is the strategic element in chess. But then there is the tactical side to chess, which I think a player who learns the rules for the first time very, very quickly becomes all too well acquainted with the tactical nature the second that they drop a piece, right? And when we consider that the chess is really these two broad categories, we can understand that there is no way you can really develop as a chess player and be successful if you have glaring weaknesses in either area. If you don't know good strategy, good chess strategy, if you don't understand the value of controlling the center, that's a strategic element, the value of developing, that's another strategic element, the value of preserving a good pawn structure, for example, then you will lose many, many games that you need not have lost had you understood these concepts. But all the strategy in the world is not going to help you if you don't have good tactical understanding and tactical vision. So this is what the next section is all about, and it will only be a relatively basic look into the world of tactics. There are more advanced sections to cover in the future. So the first thing that we should do is we should define what a tactic is. I think most people understand what a tactic is, but let's just take a moment to define it. Well, what it is a sequence of moves that doesn't really give your opponent a choice. Your opponent can maybe go down one path or down another path, but in any case, no matter how he responds, he has a limited choice, and no matter which way he responds, if the tactic is sound, by the time that the sequence of moves has finished, you have gotten some tangible gain, as we say. And so we can see that really tactics are very short-term, very concrete sequences of moves. Now, we're going to be covering a lot of different types of tactics categories in this section, right? We're going to be talking about things like discovered attacks, or the importance of X-rays, and as well, of course, all the more basic tactics categories like pins, or skewers, or forks. We're also going to be covering that. But for this introductory section, while we will be touching on the more common types of tactics and the methods used, I want to help you answer the question of how to identify tactics. So now that we know what a tactic is, we've defined it, let's now talk about when to look for tactics and what kind of considerations should we keep in mind? What kind of characteristics does any given position have that might suggest to us perhaps there will be a tactic here? So let's talk about that now. The first thing that may alert you to the possibility that a tactic might be in the air is king safety. So what I like to talk to my students a lot about, actually, when it comes to noticing their own king safety and noticing the opponent's king safety, is I like to think of it in terms of two broad categories, right? The first category is the king vulnerable? Is it in some kind of general danger or potential danger? And the second thing is very concrete. Can the king be checked? So these are the two categories I like to focus on. So here we have a situation where neither king is, of course, especially unsafe because there are no other pieces, right? But just forget about the remaining pieces for now. We'll add some pieces in a second. But the important point is to see what are the open lines for the white king here along which it might be checkable. Well, we can see that the king is open along this diagonal, and it's also open along the first rank. So if there are going to be tactics against the white king, more than likely they will come from one of these two directions. As for the black king, Well, you might be saying it seems pretty safe. And it's true. It does have one general weakness though. And that is that because all of the pawns in front of it, none of them have advanced. If white had a rook or a queen, one of the heavy pieces, we could picture a situation where the rook would give check along the back rank and it would in fact be checkmate. So that would be the big danger for black in this position. So let's tweak the position slightly now. Here we've placed 2 rooks on the board and a knight for white versus just a rook and a bishop for black. So black is at first sight in a lot of trouble. However, it's his move in this position. And so he plays the move bishop takes knight. And we see that this move works tactically, shall we say, because not only is the knight undefended here, and not only can the rook be forked to the king, but specifically we see that the king is in check along this diagonal. If the king wasn't in check, this move wouldn't be possible. And the reason for that is shown after the king steps away from the check. If black now captures the rook, because in this case he's not capturing with check, white is now free to move. So rook e8, check. Rook has to go back to d8 to block the check. Rook takes rook and it's checkmate. So what happened? Well, in the original position, white did have what we would say is a tactical threat of rook to e8, but it wasn't possible to play it in time because he was in check. This possibility for black of capturing the knight would simply not exist if it wasn't for the fact that the pawn had moved and the diagonal is open. So hopefully you can appreciate that there are these 2 big considerations to keep in mind. Specifically, can my king or my opponent's king be placed in check? And more generally, is my king weak in any particular way? For example, is there a risk of checkmate along the back rank? Or, for instance, perhaps in this position, white, instead of having 3 pawns, could be missing the g2 pawn, and that would make his king a lot weaker in general. So, when you're looking for tactics, the first thing to watch out for is king safety. Now let's talk about the second point, which is just as important, and that is whether you have any pieces that are either undefended or not so well defended. So let's show what I mean by that. Any piece or any pawn, really any point at all in a position, even a square, that is not defended gives rise to tactical possibilities. So here in this position, we have a situation where it's an endgame and white is up 2 pawns overall. However, we can say his king is not especially safe, right? But also not especially unsafe, because these pawns right here, they may be somewhat damaged with these doubled pawns, but on the other hand, there aren't many pieces left on the board. So this kind of problem is not much of a big deal as we move to an endgame. Let's look at undefended points in this position. Well, none of the pawns are undefended, but we notice that the knight is undefended, and also black's rook is undefended. In fact, even black's bishop on c4 is undefended. So, depending on whose move it is, the evaluation of the position is going to be very, very different. If it's black to move, he will capture the knight on d3, and after that, with this pawn on a4 being quite far advanced and easy to support, it will be very, very difficult for white to survive. I don't think it's possible. Now, on the other hand, if it's white to play, he has a couple of choices. He could capture the rook, or he could defend his knight instead. So what do you think white should do? If you said capture the rook, you would in fact be wrong. Capturing the rook makes sense because, hey, now if he captures our rook, It's not an even exchange because after bishop takes rook, king takes bishop, I've won a piece. However, the problem is you still have an undefended piece here on b2, and black will play the move pawn to a3, attacking your knight and creating not only the threat of capturing your knight, but also the threat of advancing the pawn and promoting. And faced with these two threats, there is actually no way that white can stop both of them. So he can move the knight away, but pawn to a2 is an impossible move to stop. So we see here a very funny tactical example, because actually if we were to go back in this position and just play the move rook to d1, defending our knight, then after almost any reasonable move by black, this is probably a draw. We won't get into why, but with this pawn structure, it is more or less an equal position here. Although in a practical game, anything can happen. So this is the first thing, but what I want to point out is how important any undefended points in a position are. We saw how the knight is undefended, the rook is undefended, the pawn on a4 was undefended as well after the knight came to b2. In fact, it was undefended before, but it was undefended and attacked, as we said, means a hanging piece. And so we see that the whole position is very, very unstable. The bishop for black is also undefended. The rook for white is defended. But after the move knight takes b2, how many times is it defended? It's defended one time, and it's attacked one time. This is what I meant when I said, are the pieces defended well enough, or are they a little bit loose? Do we have the same number of attackers as defenders? That's always a risky business for either side. Now, I also want to draw your attention to the importance of whether a king can be placed in check or whether a king is generally weak or not. So here, for example, we see that after bishop takes rook, if the king was instead on g1, then white would just win because he ignores the bishop and instead he'd pick up the pawn and then he would press the advantage of these three pawns. Now, similarly, if we go back to the starting position, in this position, if we tweak it a little bit and instead we place the king on c8, well, let's see what happens then. Now, white would play the move rook to c1, using tactics, specifically a pin on the bishop on c4 against the king, using tactics in order to win material and therefore win the game. There is no way for black to break the pin or to defend his bishop, since the move rook to b4 would be a disaster. So now he not only has the two undefended pieces that he had in the beginning, but now they're both attacked. And on top of that, after the rook captures the bishop, it will fork the pawn and the king. And so white may very well end up winning a lot more material. Now, let's give one final example of how a checkable king, this is an unsafe king, shall we say, but a checkable king can also foil the opponent's plans. So here, the position has changed insofar as we've placed the king on b6 instead. And the key difference is that now white can capture the rook, because after bishop takes rook with check means that white cannot take the pawn, but in this case it's okay. King takes bishop is a good move for him, because if black, let's say, defends the pawn, then after knight takes pawn, white will win this king and pawn endgame. And if black now pushes, white has a saving move, in fact a winning move, knight to c4 check. With this move, white does not give enough time for black to push his pawn, and so it's a simple win and black can resign. So we see once again that black's entire idea failed because his king was vulnerable to check. But this section has served a little bit as a reminder of this initial point of king safety, but also let's go back to this position, and in fact let's change up the king again. We see that in this position, any piece that is undefended, we saw in the various combinations, we saw how all of the undefended points, as well as the vulnerable kings, as well as, in the case after knight takes b2, this rook, which is not undefended, but it's a little bit loose in the sense that it's attacked and defended once each. So all of these points play huge roles, play a critical role in any kind of tactic. So watch out for any piece or pawn or even square that is either undefended or not so well defended.